All right, guys. Well, good afternoon, or rather, I guess, evening. Welcome back, everybody. Class getting started in a couple minutes, but for now, thank you so much for being here and for all your attention and hard work through the semester. We'll get our lecture ready to go in just about 2 minutes. Okay. All right, yeah. Hey, Alexandra, hello. Anybody that's here, feel free to say hi or anything else. Always great to check in with you guys. Hey, Brooklyn. How's it going, Danny? Hey, Sol, Andrea. Hope your day is going pretty good. All right, and hey, Rachel, Alex. Nice. And hey, Gary. Iris, Ronald, good to see you guys. Hope you're doing well, staying healthy. You know, the whole coronavirus is really on the rise, I guess. A lot of cases are happening all around, so definitely try your best to take whatever precautions you can to stay safe. Yes, the purple tier is back for Orange County. So I guess there are new restrictions. I work at a couple of campuses, right? So I also teach some classes over at Chapman, and that's in Orange. And they were the one campus, I don't know if it's because it's a private school or what, that was really trying to press to get us to get some limited in-person instruction again. And so they were trying to, do a hybrid model. They were basically advising some of us we should consider, going back to the classroom. They'll have more spaced out rooms and everyone will be enforcing these distancing measures. And, there'll be lower classroom attendance caps. But they basically, because now it's back to the purple tier, they had to reverse that decision. So I think it kind of make them look a little bad. They've tried to rush a return to the campus and then they had to pretty abruptly, just reverse course. So anyway, no such thing at Cal State Fullerton, which is nice. We've got a pretty clear policy, at least for this academic year. And then, with the vaccine and, effective distribution, hopefully next year, the next administration too, we'll have a bit better of a status quo and we'll be able to start returning to normal. But anyway, that's just outside, I guess, of our concerns for the moment anyway, at least not directly related to it. We're talking today about another subject in philosophy. So let me bring you guys back up to speed and kind of take you into the next topic. As we started the semester, we were all involved with the discussion of the philosophy of religion and arguments about the existence of God. Then we moved into the topic of ethics, which has to do with morality, right and wrong, good and bad. And then we talked about epistemology a little bit, the theory of knowledge. What is the concept of knowledge? What is the classical definition? What are the different components or criteria for knowledge? And what are some criticisms of the ancient account? And then, we just we finished just now talking about the metaphysics of time, another major topic in philosophy and in science, how to understand time, what's the difference between the classical kind of Newtonian view of it and the much different space-time theory of Einstein, and what metaphysical, philosophical implications does that have. So now we're all moving on into another subject. So the next topic is the philosophy of mind, okay? And let me ask you, did I give you guys at least a starting description of the philosophy of mind last Thursday? Did I mention to you some of the big questions that we consider in the philosophy of mind? Does anybody know anything about that? If so, let me hear in this chat. What do you think is the philosophy of mind? Okay, Ronald, we talked about it a little bit. I just want to revive your memory a bit. What was your memory of the discussion? What is the philosophy of mind about? You or anyone can tell me that. What is that? No, nothing. Are the mind and the brain the same thing? Good, that's one of the questions. Is the brain, well, not if the brain is two different things, Danny, but if the mind and the brain are two different things, or are they just the same thing? Correct. So yeah, let me just mention some of those things one more time to get ourselves oriented on this topic again. So the philosophy of mind is a subject in philosophy that considers the topic of consciousness, thought, experience. So me and you are not like just a table or a chair, just something that sits there and is an inanimate object with no ability to perceive. We are subjects, right? So we actually see things, feel things, hear things. We have the five senses: sight, taste, touch, hearing, and smell. And so therefore we have a point of view, a perspective. We can feel pain, pleasure. You can have a memory. Right now you can have like a random daydream or something that you imagine. So your mind, is conscious. You have consciousness. Not everything in the universe has consciousness. To the contrary, if you really just look around you, even in the room that you're in right now, most of the stuff is not conscious. Okay, so we are interested in consciousness, and yes, Sierra, there are different positions on this question of what's the nature of consciousness. One of the main questions in the philosophy of mind is consciousness just a physical process, a physical phenomenon, or is it something that is rather not physical, something that defies a physical analysis? So here are two main positions in the philosophy of mind, okay? Okay, one of them is monism. And sort of the rival, the opposite idea is dualism. Now, monism, I'll start by describing it. Monism is a position that says everything in this whole universe is really just made out of one kind of substance. Okay, so everything in the universe okay, monism. Everything in the universe is made just out of only one kind of substance. Now I'm going to go into more depth, but let me quickly state the definition of dualism so you get a sense of the contrast. Dualism is the position that everything in the universe is not made out of just one substance, but it's made out of two kinds of substance. All right, so that's the definition of this concept. Everything in the universe is made out of two kinds of substance. Okay, now, dualism says there's two substances. If you break everything down, at the end of the day, everything's made out of one of these two kinds of substances, but there's only these two and they make everything. Monism says there's actually just only one. If you look at the etymology of these words, which is sort of like the analysis of the root meanings of the parts of the word, monism has the word mono in it, like monogamy means having one partner, or a monologue is just one speaker in a play. So mono means one. Therefore, monism is the position that there is just one type of fundamental substance that makes everything. Dualism embodies the prefix dual or duo, meaning two. So right, like name a more iconic duo is like two people, right? So duo means two. Dualism, therefore, is the position that everything in the universe is made out of two different kinds of substance. Okay, and I see your comment, Brooklyn, that your Wi-Fi is acting up. Not to worry. Hopefully your connection is a little more stable now. If anyone else is experiencing any issue, please do let me know. But sometimes slowdowns do happen. They usually just clear up after a moment. But if it persists, let me know. Okay. Now, about these substances that are being discussed on either view, let me tell you about those substances. Okay, so here are two substances. Okay, so one of them is physical matter. Read that. Physical matter. Now, what is physical matter? It is anything that is extended in space, and the most fundamental unit of matter is often considered to be the atom. Okay, so it is something that is extended in space, and the most basic part of that is a single atom of matter. Okay, so what the definition says there is anything that is extended in space, and in parentheses at the end, slash, parentheses, atoms to be specific. So extended in space just means something occupies some space. Like, is this marker extended in space? Yes, because you see it's got like some shape, some mass. It occupies the region of space traced by the outline here of the shape of the object. So nothing else can occupy the same position in space because it, as they say, occludes other objects from taking that position. Sort of like I'm sitting in this chair, and I would have to be removed from the chair for something else to occupy the same position because I'm extended in space. So extended in space, it's a term that's preferred in philosophical discussions of matter. It just refers to something that takes up space. So it's like a non-zero unit of matter that takes up some space. And the most fundamental building block of this extended matter is the atom. Okay? Now, the other kind of substance that is discussed is what we call the mind. Okay? Now, in dualism and in monism, in the philosophy of mind, the term mind doesn't take on or carry the meaning that it sometimes does in everyday life. Because when you hear the word mind, maybe you just think of the brain. But the philosophical meaning of the term mind is more like the soul, because the definition of it is something that is not extended in space and is still nonetheless thinking. So something that is thinking, that's conscious, but it's not extended in space. Okay, so that's mind. Something that is not extended in space and is thinking. Okay, so maybe a little bit compressed, but what it says there is mind, colon, definition. Something that is not extended in space and is thinking. So mind, imagine consciousness without any physical material basis. Okay, so like think about as though your soul exists, and that can still carry on and continue having consciousness, even if, and let's be honest, when, the physical body that you have is annihilated through death and decomposition. So if you believed in the soul, if you believed in the afterlife, then you already have a kind of working idea in your own mind of, well, I shouldn't use the term twice, but you already have a working understanding of the concept of mind. Mind, again, is not a very, very small physical object, like a tiny little pebble that you'll find somewhere in your body that you could chop up or dissect or take apart. No, it's literally got no extension. So it's like an extensionless point in math or something, like something that has absolutely no dimensions, no weight, no mass, no shape, no volume. So it's literally not a physical object. The mind, in this definition, is something that does not occupy any space at all, but somehow, nonetheless, it's conscious, it's thinking. So imagine a pure, disembodied consciousness that has the ability to still think. Nonetheless, it's not a physical object. Okay, so now monism here says that there's only one kind of substance that makes everything in the universe. And depending on which one of these two they think is the only one, then that means there are two possible types of monism. So now as a sort of subheading underneath monism, I'm going to tell you what the two versions of it are. Okay, because one type of monism is called physicalism. Okay, so subcategory of monism, you've got physicalism. And physicalism says that everything in the universe is made out of this substance, physical matter, and including in the claim us and our consciousness. So according to physicalist monism, everything in the universe is made out of matter, even you and me and our thoughts and experiences, our mental lives, they're just physical states too of the brain. Okay, so physicalism. Everything in the universe is made out of matter, including us and our consciousness. Okay, now we've seen the definition for dualism. That's been discussed, and since I don't need to provide the definition again, I'm going to erase that part to give me a little extra room to write out the other type of monism below this one. Okay, so one type of monism now you can see is this one, which is called physicalism. The physicalist branch of monism says that yes, there's one substance, but by the way, what it is just matter. So on physicalist view of the world, everything is just aggregations of atoms bundled together to form, macroscopic objects. This table, this book, the board that you see, the marker in my hand, they're all just objects that are physical objects made out of physical matter, made out of atoms. And according to physicalism, it's not just those inanimate objects, but even us, conscious beings, with the ability to see, feel, hear, etc. We are also just physical objects, and we're just made out of matter. So according to physicalism, there's nothing about your ability to think and experience that is somehow supernatural, paranormal, or related to something other than mass and matter. So if you're a physicalist, what you would believe is that there's no possibility for there to be like the afterlife. There would be no possibility for your consciousness to continue to exist if the physical brain ceases to exist or ceases to function. Because on physicalism, the brain and the mind are the same thing. It's just the brain. So without a brain, there couldn't be consciousness, right? A physicalist would say something like this. Here's a marker, and the marker doesn't have consciousness. But why? It's not a, complicated reason. It's because it doesn't have a brain, it doesn't have a central nervous system, so it doesn't have the physiological support system to produce consciousness. But here we are, and we do have consciousness. Look, right now you're even just listening to a lecture, and the conscious being is the only thing that can do that. But on this viewpoint, the difference between you and the marker, the reason that you have consciousness and it doesn't is because of a physical difference. Like if we were to look inside of you, we'd find a brain, we would find the central nervous system and all of the, material basis to have consciousness. So there can't be consciousness just sort of disembodied and floating free without a physical structure that produces it. Okay, so that's physicalism. There's another type of monism, and I'm just going to mention it, but we're not going to really take a lot of time talking about it because it's kind of now been, over the centuries, kind of relegated to the sidelines. But, we want to be thorough and at least include a reference to it. So another type of monism is what's called idealism. Okay, now what idealism says is just that everything in the universe is made out of ideas. And so there's actually no matter and nothing is physical. That's a completely opposite extreme view. So everything in the universe is just made out of ideas. So idealism, in the philosophical sense, there's a totally unrelated meaning of the word idealism in just everyday speech. Like when someone, we say they're an idealist, like, oh, they believe that good and right things will always prevail and that, justice always wins in the long run. But that's not what we're talking about here. Idealism as a metaphysical position in a philosophy of mind is the idea that everything in the whole universe is really just made out of thoughts. So according to this view, and it's a weird view, but according to it, what is this table and this chair that look like they exist right in front of me? Well, they're actually just ideas. These are ideas in the mind, and so is everything else. So there's actually no physical matter. It seems like there is, but it's just thoughts. Now, it's a kind of weird view that I don't think has too much support today in 2020, but if you go back a few centuries, there were a lot of more favorable arguments for it, because I guess, you know, science has made so much progress that it seems less and less credible over the years. And one weird thing about it is, okay, you may be wondering, okay, if everything is just an idea or a thought, then what happens if nobody's thinking the thought? Like right now, if nobody's thinking about, I don't know, the next closest sun, star to our sun, Alpha Centauri, if nobody's thinking about it, does it just not exist? Well, one author named George Berkeley, who's a Christian writer from the 1800s, he said that, actually, sorry, from the 1700s, I believe. But what he said is that when nobody's thinking about the idea, God, you know, exists and he thinks of it. And so if not you, then God maintains the thoughts in his mind so that there's still some kind of independent existence of those things that are outside of your current awareness. But if God wanted to stop thinking about them, then they would just cease to exist in the blink of an eye. But anyway, just mentioning it for the sake of being comprehensive, but telling you now that we're going to kind of set it to the side, and we're really going to be zeroing in on this different debate, the debate between physicalism and dualism. So that is going to be our topic for a little while. Now you understand a little bit more about the terminology, so let me just go on and tell you what the real debate is. The debate is, are there two substances that make up the universe, both matter and mind, or is it just all matter? Okay, because what a dualist believes is that it's not that there's only matter or that there's only mind, but that there are both. Okay, so in the dualist perspective, most things that you see around you are just made out of matter. But when it comes to consciousness and beings like us that have thoughts and perceptions and a mental life, the dualist believes that that part of us anyway is not made out of matter, but is the mind, which lacks any material basis and is just pure consciousness, like a soul or a spirit inside of you. Now we're going to study arguments then for both of those positions, for dualism and for physicalist monism. And we're going to start with an argument for dualism, and that takes us toward the work of our friend Descartes. So that's the author that I'm going to spend the rest of the meeting talking about. So one more time, René Descartes, famous French philosopher of the early modern period. He lived from, sorry if that glare is there, he lived from 1596 until 1650. And he wrote this classic book, The Meditations, which we've taken one pass at so far in the class. That's from 1641. Okay, now we've looked at the Meditations earlier in our course when we studied epistemology. Descartes was the guy who talked about the method of doubt. The idea of the book is he's trying to discover what is certain. He thinks that we need to discover what is totally certain beyond any possibility of doubt, because until we can find out what those certain things are, then maybe our whole system of knowledge is based on a weak foundation. It has to be based on something that's totally solid, that can't be doubted. So he says in this book, I'm going to try and find out what is certain. In the beginning of the Meditations, that just for review, to remind you of what he said there, he said, okay, let's use the method of doubt to determine what is certain. Now, does anybody remember what is the method of doubt? That takes us a few weeks back, I know. But even if you have a vague memory of it, what do you think is the method of doubt? It says, if you want to discover what is totally certain and can't be false, then what is the method you should take? How does the method of doubt work? Anybody? Because it kind of comes back into play with the lecture today, so I just want to check in with you. Assume to be false anything that could possibly be doubted. Yes, perfect, Andrea. So that's right. The method of doubt says that if there's even a small sliver of possibility that something could be false, even if it's very, very unlikely that it's false, just the basic idea that it's possibly false, then that's too much doubt and you'll assume it is false and set it to the side. And so he thought that if you employ the method of doubt, eventually you'll find something that cannot be doubted at all. Okay, well, in his opening chapter, he said using the method of doubt, I'm able to doubt everything that I perceive with the five senses, like everything that I can see, taste, touch, hear, or smell. Those things can all be false because maybe you're living in a fake reality. Maybe you're dreaming everything, or maybe, you know, to take a more modern example, you're in a computer simulation right now. If that's the case, then everything you think that you perceive could be false and non-existent. So he says, because of this admittedly, you know, far out possibility that you're dreaming all the time, who knows, but maybe, if that is possible, then we'll assume your senses are unreliable. Okay, after that, he searches again for something that can't be doubted. And he, you know, asks, well, could it be math and logic that's not doubtful at all? Because, you know, 2 + 2 = 4. That seems like it's pretty much set in stone, and that can't be wrong. Even if everything I'm seeing is a dream, can't I at least hang on to the truth of math and such? Even there, Descartes says this is capable of being doubted too. And if you remember, the reason he gave for it is a little odd, but he said it's possible because there could be some external deceiver who's tricking you about it. At first he says God could be the one that's deceiving you, but then he withdraws that comment because he knows that it's God and God is too good to be a deceiver. But nonetheless, there could be some evil demon or some other type of, you know, creature like that that has the ability to control what you perceive and isn't perfect like God. So because of the possibility of some malicious deceiver, even math and logic can't be given as certain. Okay, so if you remember in the second meditation, chapter 2, he picks it up by saying, well, actually there is this one thing though that can't be doubted at all. And maybe someone knows that or can remember or tell me what you think Descartes said was the one thing that survives and bypasses the method of doubt, something that even the method of doubt cannot, you know, touch. And what was that one certain thing that survives even the most high-level doubt? Who knows what that was? Let me hear from you. Something that can't be doubted. Okay, good, Gary, that you exist. Perfect, yes. Why is it that that is impossible to doubt? Because it doesn't even make sense to doubt it. Since if you are questioning your existence, then the very fact of you questioning anything establishes the existence of that who questions. So maybe everything's a dream, but even if everything's a dream that you're seeing around you, still the dreamer having the dream must exist in one way or another. So the method of doubt undermines the certainty of all sense perception and even math and logic, but the knowledge that you exist remains absolutely certain because you're thinking. Okay, so that was just me recapping for you the first 2 chapters of the Meditations, because all of that stuff now comes back again as we're now meeting Descartes in the 6th meditation of his book. Okay, so just a note on the structure of the book. The Meditations is divided into 6 chapters. Each chapter is labeled meditation and then a number. So like basically chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, but he calls them meditation 1, meditation 2. Okay, so earlier in the semester we read meditation 1 and 2. Now we're coming full circle and we have this 6th meditation as the topic assigned for today. So meditation 6, the last one, the 6th one. Okay, so in meditation 6, Descartes gives an argument for dualism. He kind of has been building this argument for dualism throughout his whole book, but it's only in the 6th chapter where he really ties it all together and presents his ultimate conclusions. So what I'm going to do for you guys is to summarize the basic points that he makes in the course of his argument for dualism. Some of the stuff I'll tell you is only indirectly referred to in the actual text because Descartes sometimes makes an indirect reference to the intervening chapters in between chapter 2 and 6. And since that's not included in the book, I have to kind of clarify some of the obscurities in what he mentions there. So I'm going to basically present his full detailed argument for dualism. When you go back to the book, if you, for example, choose to write on this topic, because this is one of the options for the paper, you know, I would encourage you to connect the actual statements in the text to my more you know, rational reconstruction of his argument, because I'm basically taking some liberties to say it in a way that's clearer. But it's always good to have textual support. If you choose to write on this paper, you should still use some of the book as, you know, evidence. Okay, so meditation 6, where Descartes gives an argument for dualism. Now we're going to really jump into it. Okay, so I'm just going to label the top of the board Descartes' argument for dualism. Okay, now when it comes to arguments in philosophy and in logic, and we've already kind of seen this a couple times in the semester, but just as a reminder, they take on a certain form, and this form of an argument takes in logic is what's called standard form. The standard form of an argument is that you list what are called the premises until you reach the last premise, and then the conclusion is at the end. Premises is just terminology which means piece of evidence for a conclusion. Okay, so like the premise statements are the reasons that are given to try and lead you to the conclusion of the author's argument. So this argument for dualism, it's a pretty long argument, to be honest. There's a lot of premises in it. That means there's many steps toward the conclusion and many little pieces of evidence that he provides. But we're going to take it step by step, and then by the time we're done, you'll have a good understanding of why he thinks, dualism can be shown or proven to be true. Okay, so the first premise of the argument, and I'll just number each premise here, is the idea that using the method of doubt, I'm able to doubt, as we just said, everything I perceive with the senses, and even math and logic. Okay. Okay, so first premise, it just refers to what the method of doubt calls into question, or what you can doubt once you start applying this method. Once the method of doubt has been assumed, well, it allows you to doubt everything that you perceive by the senses, because it could be a dream, and it also allows you to doubt everything that you've learned or thought you've learned through math and logic, because it could be evil demon. So those things could be fake and false. But second premise. But despite all of this, despite this claim, one thing remains certain, and we just mentioned that, and that is that nonetheless, I still know that I exist, at least as a thinking mind, even if I don't know for sure about the body part, but I at least know that I have a mind because I am thinking. Okay, so second premise, despite this, I know for certain that I exist as a mind because I am thinking. Okay, so first two steps of the argument, first two premises, and I hope I haven't lost you so far, right? I'm just kind of reminding you of the basics of the meditations one more time, and that's how the argument starts. It starts by mentioning that there's a method of doubt. If we use that method, all kinds of stuff is now subject to doubt, and maybe it's not true. But nonetheless, there's one thing that cannot be doubted no matter what, and that is the knowledge that you have that you exist, at least as a mind, because you're thinking. Okay, so from here he takes the argument in a new direction and he adds the next premise. The next premise says that, okay, well, at least I know I exist and I have a mind, or that I am a mind, because I'm thinking. Now, since I am thinking and I've got this mind, well, there are ideas in my mind. So in the mind, there are ideas. And he points out to us one particular idea that he thinks holds a unique position and a special importance, and that's the idea of God. Okay, so he says, in my mind, which I know exists because I'm thinking, there are ideas, including the idea of God. Okay. Okay, so the third premise just continues the argument by mentioning that it's clear that I exist because I'm thinking, and since I've got a mind, there are ideas inside of it, and one of those ideas is the idea of God. Okay, now at moments during the presentation of the argument, you see that I have a somewhat limited board in terms of size, so I'm going to have to, clear the board and then continue to state the argument premises. In your own notes, though, it would be better, I think, if you had the space to allow the premises to continue running in a list vertically down. So like premise 4 would be below number 3. Just a note for your physical notes. But I'm going to now clear that so that I can add premise 4, 5, and 6, and the rest. Okay. Okay, so premise 1, using the method of doubt, I can doubt everything I've perceived by the senses, even math and logic. Premise 2, but still, despite that, I know that I exist at least as a mind because I'm thinking. Premise 3, in my mind there are ideas. And by the way, one of those ideas is the idea of God. So now, premise 4. He just zeroes in now for a moment longer on that one idea we have of God. He says the idea of God is different and it's unique. It stands alone. Among all the ideas in your mind, he says there's no other idea like the idea of God because it is the one and only idea of something that is infinite. So he says the idea of God is unique because it is the idea of an infinite being, Okay, like when you're thinking of anything other than God, you're thinking of something that's limited, that's finite. If it was like thinking of me, I mean, I haven't been here forever. I was born in the 80s and I won't live forever. So I have limits. I have limits in time and space. I'm not everywhere all at once. And I'm not at all times throughout space and time. So I've got limits, so do you, and so does anything else that can kind of come into being and then cease to exist. But the idea of God is not like that. It's the idea of something that's absolutely unlimited and infinite. So that's the premise. The idea of God is unique because it is the idea of an infinite being. Okay, so the idea of God's a little different, and it's special, it's unique, we could say, and the reason is because it's the idea of an infinite being. Now, to explain the next premise, I want to walk you through like a little explanation that was given to me when I was a college student a long time ago at UCLA. I was studying this same material, and I had a good teacher that handed this example to me, and I'm just going to pass it on to you because it at least helped me understand. So hopefully it will do the same for you. Okay, so it's almost like a little math problem, guys. Take a moment to think of this. So here we've got 2 containers. Here's A. Down here is B. Okay? Now, let's just say that B, second container below, it has some fluid in it. And let's just say it has 1 gallon. Now, all I'm telling you is, where did this gallon come from that's now sitting inside of B? It came from A. Okay, so A deposited this gallon to B. All right. So if you know that B has a gallon in it, and it got it from A, then logically, okay, and this should be pretty easy, how much carrying capacity in terms of volume must A have at least? The amount of volume this can hold, if the other facts are true, it has to be at least equal to or greater than or equal to what amount? That's just a little question. What is the carrying capacity of A? It's greater than or equal to a gallon. Yes, it's at least a gallon. And there should be absolutely no doubt about that, because if it was less than a gallon, that would just break logic, right? There would be no way that something that is a half gallon gave a gallon, because then it would be giving more than it itself could hold. Okay, so if this is what has been deposited, and this is the depositor, then of course it has to at least have as much as was given to the second thing. Okay? Now, this now is going to be like a little metaphor. So now I want you to imagine that you're like this second container here. And you've got an idea in your head. Now, you're not like a container of liquid per se, but let's just say by example, by analogy, you're like this container because you contain an idea. many ideas, but one of them is the idea of God. Okay, now how much reality did Descartes say the idea of God has that is already in your mind? I mean, so already there's an idea of God in your mind, and he says that's a crazy, cool, different idea because it's the idea of what kind of being? You could just tell me. The idea that you have of God in your mind is an idea with a certain amount of reality, would be the way he puts it. And it's a question I need you to give me the answer. How much reality does he say the idea of God possesses? Quantity, if you can give it. Infinite, yes, Andrea, that's right. So the idea of God is the idea of an infinite being. And so that means that right now you have an idea in your mind of something that is infinite. So I'm just going to use this infinity symbol here, which is like a tilted sideways number 8, figure 8. Right now you have this idea of God in your mind, and it's an infinite idea. So what he says is this: the idea has to come from somewhere, okay? It has to come from some source. So question, whatever causes the idea of God in your mind, and now just sort of keep your answer parallel to what we said about the example of like cups containing water of a certain amount of size. You have an idea of God in your mind. It has infinite reality. It comes from some source. So the question then, how much reality or how great must the cause be of your idea of God? It has to be great, yes, but it has to be at least how great or how much reality? The effect, the idea that is now in your mind, is an infinite idea. So this effect comes from a cause. The cause has to have at least how much reality? Infinite, correct. Okay, so it's exactly the same kind of parallel logic. If you have an idea in your mind that's of something infinite, then it can't be coming from something that's less than infinite, right? That would not be possible. There'd be no way, he argues, for an idea of an infinite being to pop up in your mind if it was generated by something that's actually not infinite. So, in other words, since this idea of God is in your mind, and since it is an infinite idea, the cause of it must be at infinite too. Otherwise, the cause would have less reality than is given to the effect. And that would be just as much a violation of logic, he says, as to claim that, you know, here's a gallon of water in container B, and it was deposited from a little teaspoon holder that gave it the 1 gallon. That would not be possible. And so he says the same here. You have an idea of God in your mind, but nothing that is not infinite could have given that idea to you. So in other words, he believes that this essentially proves the existence of what or who? Can you follow that little logic? What do you think? He believes then, based on these reasonings, that there has to therefore be what? Yes, there has to be God. There has to be God. Who can tell me one time, restate why? Why does he say there must be a God? I kind of just tried to explain it, but now if you can explain it, that'll give me good confidence that it came across through these, internet bandwidth pathways to your mind. So why does this man Descartes say that God must exist? In your words, if you could say it one time. I don't know. Let's see what you come up with. And I think you'll have no problem really, but just what would be your way of putting it? Why is it argued by the man Descartes that there has to be a God? We went through the reasoning, but I just want to see if you can say it on your own. Even if it's just a imperfect way of putting it, something's better than nothing. So what is his position about this? Why is it that God must exist? Based on what reason? Okay, Danny, because if God is an idea that is an infinite being, then the cause must also be at least infinite. Yes, that is very good, and that's correct. Okay, so now I can, having described and explained this, I can say it as a premise, premise 5. Okay, so the idea of God is unique because it is the idea of an infinite being. Okay, so since the idea of God is an infinite idea, it must be caused by something that is infinite, and therefore God exists. Thus, God exists. Okay, now this is like a key step in his argument. And good, Brooklyn, you said there has to be an infinite being to create the concept of an infinite being. Right. This is a key step in his argument, and in a way, it might remind some of you guys of the ontological argument of Anselm, because Anselm basically says the idea of God is so great that there has to really be a God. And it's a little different the way he puts it, but it's a similar format, because he's saying that, yeah, you have an idea of God in your mind, and it has to come from somewhere, but the idea is so great that it could only come from the actual God. It couldn't come from anything that's less than infinite. Okay, but now that gives him ammo or leverage, however you want to put it, to make some further claims. Now that he thinks he has proven that God exists, that really unlocks the whole remaining steps of the argument. So the next thing he says is this: since he believes he's established God exists now, he can say that God is known to be perfectly good. The word for that, if you remember, is omnibenevolent. So since God exists and is known to be perfectly good, Descartes believes that means that he cannot be a deceiver. He's not a deceiver, because to deceive, to manipulate, to lie, basically, to trick people is not good. It's deceptive, and so it's bad. Therefore, God, who is supremely good, would not be a deceiver. Okay, so let me add that next premise. Since God exists and is known to be perfectly good, he is not a deceiver. All right, so let me just sort of make sure that you follow the whole argument. I'll walk you through the steps again as we get to each new point. It started by him saying, according to the method of doubt, so much stuff can be doubted. Maybe everything you perceive with your five senses, maybe even math and logic, but one thing can't be doubted. And that one thing is that you know you exist. Even if you don't know you have a body, you know you have a mind because you're thinking. Okay, well, next point is that you got ideas in the mind. And one of them is the idea of God, and that holds a special kind of position, because among all ideas you have, that's the only one that's the idea of an infinite being. Okay, well, as we just said, since the idea of God is infinite, the cause of the idea must also be infinite, and that means, therefore, there has to be a God, a real infinite being. And yeah, Brooklyn, I mean, the way you put it pretty much is good. The idea has to come from somewhere, but it's too great to come from anything other than God himself. So nothing could explain the fact that the idea of God exists in your mind except for the actual God giving it to you. Now we say that God exists, and since he exists and he's known to be perfectly good, he is not a deceiver. Okay, so what follows from God not being a deceiver? That's the next step of Descartes' argument. So I'm clearing the board to create space for premise, the next premise. So here comes premise 7. And what he says now is this. So since God is not a deceiver, that means that if I have clear and distinct perceptions, they must be true. They're guaranteed to be true, because God would not allow those to come out to be false. Otherwise, he would be tricking you. He'd be setting you up to have beliefs that are so clear, so obvious, but nonetheless false. If he was doing that to us, then he would be tricking us all the time, and that would be contrary to his perfect goodness. So he wouldn't do that. If you have clear and distinct perceptions, God provides for those to be true, because he's too good to manipulate you about the clearest, most obvious things. Okay, so since God is not a deceiver, when I have clear and distinct perceptions, they must be true. Okay, so yes, since God's not a deceiver, this means that if you have a clear and distinct perception of something, then that would be true, because if it wasn't true, if the most obvious natural things that you believe are just false, then God would be to blame, because he would have made it so that the things seem true, but they're really not. So God is too good to deceive you. That means if you have clear and distinct perceptions, you can trust them. They're guaranteed. They're backed by the goodness of God to be true. Okay, so this takes us very close to the end of the argument. There's only a couple more premises and then the conclusion. So premise 8 is key. Premise 8 says this. It says one of my clear and distinct perceptions, which I can now place, trust and confidence in because it's guaranteed by God to be true. One of my clear and distinct perceptions is that if two things can be clearly conceived of as existing separately, then that means they really are, in reality, two separate things. Okay, so one of my clear and distinct perceptions One of my clear and distinct perceptions is that if two things can be clearly conceived of as existing separately, okay, then in that case, they really are two separate things. Okay, so one of my clear and distinct perceptions, if two things can be clearly conceived of as existing separately, then that implies that they really are two separate things. Okay. So let me give you an example to illustrate the point. But as you see it does just say that if you can clearly conceive of, in other words, if you can clearly imagine in the mind two things existing separately, no longer being connected but separate, if you can clearly imagine or conceive of the possibility of the two things existing separately, then that means that they actually can be separate and that they really are two separate things. Okay, so this is one of the clear and distinct perceptions that God guarantees is true. The idea that if two things can be clearly conceived of as existing separately, they really are two different things. So, okay, let me use this as an example. Me, Dr. Vulich, and then this watch that I'm wearing, okay? So I'm wearing, it's actually kind of a newer watch that I got, but question, you see me and this watch are not separated, okay? It's like it's on my wrist, so it's connected to me for sure. But can you clearly conceive of me and the watch existing separately? Can you? That's just a yes or no. Can you clearly, imagine in the mind's eye, me and the watch no longer being connected, but existing separately? That's just all I'm asking. Can you clearly conceive of that? And you say yes. Okay, good. I mean, this I hope doesn't stump anybody because it's not a trick question. I would hope, yes, it certainly should be very clear to you. I don't need to have this watch on my wrist, and this watch can continue to exist without being attached to me. Now, I don't have to take it off to prove this, but I'll just do it to make it even clearer. So look, what you've imagined is now actually happening. Oh my goodness, the watch is coming off. So look, there it is. It's away from me. It's over there. I'm over here. We are separated. Did I really have to demonstrate that for you to be able to clearly conceive of it? No, not really. I mean, it maybe makes it even more obvious because now it's literally happened. But before I took the watch off, I don't think anybody, I would hope, had any trouble imagining that that could clearly be possible. Okay, so point. Since it was clearly conceivable that me and the watch could exist separately, what does this mean? Well, it means that we really are not the same thing. I'm not the watch isn't me. I want it to be on my wrist, and I will wear it a lot of the time. But if it's off of my wrist and I just go in a whole separate direction, then I'll continue to exist, and it'll continue to exist, and we'll just be in two different places. So the point is that it's not just about me and the watch. That's just one straightforward example based on something right here. But any two things, if you can imagine them existing separately, then even if it's not so easy to separate them as me and the watch, I mean, that's a child's play. I just take it off of my wrist and put it over there. Some things would take a little more work to divide apart, but if it's even conceivable, then those two things can be divided and they're not necessarily the same thing. Like take, I don't know, a glass of salt water. okay? It might be a little bit more work, right, to divide the salt content from the water content, but of course that can be achieved. You can get a desalinization process and allow the water to boil and then collect the condensation from it, and the salt content will be left behind, the water will be over here. So the point he's making here is that if it's even possible to imagine the clear separation of two things that are either currently mingled together or connected, if it's possible to imagine the two things being disentangled and separated, then that means that they actually are not the same thing, even if they're temporarily attached. Okay, and let me read to you this as he says this in the book. So this is a good quote to sort of reinforce what we've now been talking about. On page 556 on the left column, he says, okay, first I know that everything which I clearly and distinctly understand is capable of being created by God so as to correspond exactly with my understanding of it. Therefore, the fact that I can clearly and distinctly understand one thing apart from another is enough to make me certain that the two things are distinct, since they are capable of being separated, at least by God. The question of what kind of power is required to bring about the separation does not affect the judgment that the two things are distinct. Thus, okay, so we'll continue in a moment, but hopefully that point has now been made clear. He's just saying clear and distinct perception's got to be true because God is not a deceiver and he wouldn't want you to get those very clear things wrong. And this is one of the clear and distinct perceptions which now we can guarantee to be true by the goodness of God. It's the idea that if two things can be clearly conceived of as existing separately, then whether or not they are separate now, they actually are not in the same object, and they are in fact two distinct beings. Okay, so the ninth premise is coming next. And actually the ninth premise is the last one before we get to the conclusion. All right, so we've been holding you in suspense, but now we're reaching the end of the argument. The ninth premise just says this. Maybe you can actually guess what it'll say. It says, I can actually clearly conceive of these two things existing separately. And this gets right to the heart of dualism. So what do you think is that statement? I can clearly conceive of the blank and the blank existing separately. What are those two things that are mentioned in the blank spaces? Good, the mind and the body. Perfect, Sierra. So I can clearly conceive of the mind and the body existing separately. And so let me write that here. Well, let me be a little more precise. I can clearly conceive of my mind and my body existing separately. Okay, now this horizontal line just means that what is below it is the conclusion of the whole argument. So like in your notes, you know, if it was ideal, I guess it would be like all 9 premises listed in a list, and then at the bottom below this horizontal line, you have a conclusion. And then Ronald, you said, I can clearly conceive that the mind and the brain are separate. Yeah, mind and body, good, because the mind is, to a physicalist, just the brain. So just to be clear, you know, distinguishing between mind and body, but no problem. Okay, I can clearly conceive of my mind and my body existing separately. So based on the 8th premise, what does that mean? What's the conclusion? When you can clearly conceive of two things existing separately, this means, according to the perfection of God and how he's not a deceiver, that when you can clearly conceive of two things existing separately, that means what about the two things? Tell me that. What follows from the fact that I can clearly conceive of my mind and the body existing separately? If you remember the 8th premise, you should be able to tell me that when you can clearly conceive these two things being separate, that means that what about the two things? That they are not the same thing. Exactly, Gary. So that means that the mind and the body are not the same thing, that they're two separate things. And that is just dualism. So that's the argument for dualism. Therefore, conclusion, hence, thus, consequently, you know, many conclusion indicator words, but therefore, the mind and the body are really two separate things. Mind and body are really two separate things. So let me zoom in on premise 9 for a moment. And yes, good Brooklyn, that they're not the same one thing, that they are two different things. I can clearly conceive of my mind and body existing separately. Why is that clearly conceivable? Well, one of the reasons takes us right back to the beginning of the meditations. When we use the method of doubt, we say that it's possible to doubt the existence of the body, because the body that you think you're looking at right now, your body, is something that you perceive with the five senses. You look in a mirror, you're using vision. You touch the arm or whatever, you feel the body using touch. Sight, taste, touch, hearing, and smell informs you about the existence of every physical object, including your own physical body. But we say that it's possible that you're dreaming everything, so who knows if all those perceptions are true. But the existence of the mind, which is thinking everything, that cannot be doubted. So according to the method of doubt, you really cannot be sure that you even have a body, even right now, but you know you have a mind. So that presses the point that it's conceivable for you, mind and body, to exist separately. Since according to the method of doubt, all bets are off whether or not the body is even real, but the mind's existence is certain. And so the possibility of you being a disembodied mind is already advanced at the beginning of the meditations, okay? And if you want, I can give you some more, I guess, relatable ways to think about that conceivability, okay? You've seen enough movies, right, or thought about the concept of death, where like a character dies and then their ghost, soul escapes the body and it goes on some adventure, it goes to heaven or hell or whatever, it just haunts people. Well, if it's clearly conceivable for you to think of the possibility, the case of, death has occurred, the body is destroyed, it no longer is working, it doesn't even maybe could be completely annihilated. But if you can imagine the persistence of consciousness continuing on after the loss of the physical body, then you can clearly conceive of the mind and body existing separately. Sometimes people talk about you've heard accounts of near-death experiences where people say, oh, I got such a traumatic injury and I actually had an experience of floating up out of my body, looking down from above at people doing surgery. I'm not granting credibility to any of those claims. I have no insight into the nature of those claims, but think of those as the type of examples given to explain how it is clearly conceivable that your mind could exist without your body. Brooklyn. So the mind can exist without the body. According to dualism, yes, according to dualism. So, right, there are arguments being exchanged here. Descartes is on the side of dualism. And so his whole position here is trying to make that argument in favor of dualism. So yes, everything we've said in today's meeting is on the side of dualism, trying to make you think that it's true. But we are going to study the other side of the argument too, as we've done throughout the semester, right? Like when we learned about, economic inequality, some guy says you should help the poor. Another guy says, no, not really, because it wouldn't be helpful. In the philosophy of religion, one person says, here's an argument that God exists, and another person tries to debunk the argument. So we're starting with an argument for dualism, and on Thursday next class, I'll teach you about the other side where people say, no, this is not a good argument, and there's just matter, there's no such thing as the separate existence of the soul. Yeah, but good Brooklyn and Andrea, today we're just looking at this case being made for the dualist position. Okay, so you can clearly conceive of the mind and the body existing separately, so that must mean that they're really two separate things, because it's a clear and distinct perception that if two things can be understood existing separately, then they really are two different things. And clear and distinct perceptions have to be true because God is good and he exists, and he wouldn't deceive you about the clear and distinct perceptions because he's good. And by the way, he exists because you have an idea of him, and the idea that you have of him has to come from a source, but since it's an infinite idea, the source has to be infinite, so there proves God exists. By the way, you have an idea of him because you just know that you're thinking, and that's like the basics of the whole method of doubt. So here, I'll read a bit from the text, and you can see him go into a little bit more discussion of the same point I was making. He says also on page 556 in the left column, thus, simply by knowing that I exist, and seeing at the same time that absolutely nothing else belongs to my nature or essence except that I am a thinking thing, I can infer correctly that my essence consists solely in the fact that I am a thinking thing. It is true that I may have a body that is very closely joined to me, but nevertheless, on the one hand, I have a clear and distinct idea of myself insofar as I'm simply a thinking, non-extended thing. And on the other hand, I have a distinct idea of body insofar as this is simply an extended, not thinking thing. And therefore, it is certain that I am really distinct from my body and I can exist without it. So the separation of two things in the mind is what gives us the guarantee that they can actually exist separately in reality. The case of me and the watch, which I mentioned as an illustration to you, is pretty easy to separate, like I said. The separation of your mind from your body is not exactly quite as simple. That's one that only, I think, he says God can do. But you can still conceive of it, right? So according to Descartes, and even just theism, right? I mean, widespread belief in theism and the afterlife holds that not only is it possible that God will separate the body from the mind, but that it's definitely going to happen to you, because the body can't survive forever, but people who believe in the soul say that it does. So I always find this as an interesting sort of full circle experience when I teach Descartes to students, because it's not uncommon for there to be a little intellectual resistance to his ideas when you first read them, because, you know, it's an understandable thing. You're hearing a guy say, hey, maybe everything's a dream. Maybe even right now you don't even have the body that you think you have. And I know a student will read that, and it's like, you know, you're in college, you're looking at this book and you're thinking, but come on, I obviously have this body. There's no way I could even exist without a body. But if you really thought that that was impossible, then that would simultaneously mean that you don't even take seriously the claim that the afterlife is a possibility. Because all Descartes is saying is that the mind can, and in fact will, exist as a separate thing from the physical body that you occupy or whatever. Okay, so like, you know, when you accuse a philosopher of saying something really far out and implausible, unbelievable, incredible, just consider the implications of what you're rejecting. You know, if you think it's not even feasible to think of the mind existing without the body, then how could you possibly believe in the doctrine of the soul and the afterlife, which is the same idea? Okay, but here's an argument for dualism. Hopefully it's understood. The basic key to it is that God exists. God is so good that he would not deceive you. One thing that's clear is that two things thought of to exist separately can actually exist separately. And since the mind and body can be thought of that way, they're actually two different things. So there's a little more I wanted to say at the very end here. After that, he also says there's a couple of other clear and distinct perceptions that we can now give confidence and trust in that were at least initially doubted according to the method of doubt. So as the sixth meditation is the last chapter of the book, he kind of sees himself returning back to the common sense perspective that we have on reality. After proving God exists, he says, well, that's great, because now I can reach further certainty that the goodness of God guarantees. So here's some other clear and distinct perceptions. Okay, one is that the external world exists. Outside of my mind. Remember, in the beginning of the meditations, he said, maybe the external world does not exist. It looks like it does, but maybe it's just a dream that you're actually having. So who knows? But now in the sixth meditation, he's like, never mind, just kidding, it does really exist. And why am I saying it now? Because now he thinks, having proven in his judgment the existence of God, the clear and distinct perceptions must be true. And this is something that is just very clear and distinct. But he doesn't even just leave it at that. He says there are reasons why this is clear and distinct. So let me mention some of those reasons. This is clear and distinct. So I'll just say C and D for short. Because, okay, one reason that that's clear and distinct is because we cannot perceive only that which is favorable. Okay, another reason is that we just literally, we cannot control what we perceive. And also, third main reason that that's clear and distinct is that memories, like memories that you have in your mind, are less vivid, they're less sharp than current experiences are, like in the moment. So memories are less vivid than current perception. Okay, so let me just mention a little discussion of each of those points. So first, if the world was a dream, okay, suppose the world was a big dream that you're having all the time, and you're the creator of the dream, you're the dreamer. So you would think in that case that your mind would have some at least limited ability to control the dream and to make it happen in whatever way you want. So, right, if the world is just not actually externally real and it's just something of your mind, then you'd expect that you'd have perception that would correspond to your desires, right? So if everything you're experiencing is just a figment of your own imagination or something that's being created in your thoughts, then what would your life be like? I mean, if this world was just a dream I was having, then I would tell you I would never go through any disadvantages, no discomforts, no obstacles. I would just will things into existence. So I would be, the wealthiest, happiest, longest living, with the most knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. I would never experience loss, harm, suffering, but those things happen. And so, of course, that makes it seem like the external world is not like just some kind of creation of me, but it's got its own independent existence because it doesn't answer to my desires. The things that I don't want to happen, sadly, sometimes they do. Car accidents, loss of loved ones, sickness, whatever. And then sometimes the things that I do want to happen don't happen, right? A result of a given election or a job interview or something, or all those things. So, oh, sorry, Ronald, I didn't see your comment before. The one section, this is just like 3 different points to expand on why this statement is clear and distinct. So the first mentioned justification of that is that it is clear and distinct that the external world exists outside of your mind. It's not just made up by your mind, because if it was, you'd only perceive good things all the time, basically, and that's not how it happens. Okay, now the second point, it's a little different, but it's similar to the first. You also can't just control what you perceive. So if the world did not independently exist and it was just a projection of your mind, then you'd believe that you could just make stuff happen by thinking it. So like right now, I challenge you to do this. Wherever you're sitting, look over to your right, and I want you to just see an alligator there. And I'm not saying like imagine an alligator to your right, but really see one, like that you could visually see as though it was actually in the room with you. Can you make that happen? I don't think so. No matter how hard you try, the closest you can come is to like have an imaginary memory of a previously seen image of an alligator, but you can't like make it exist like a hologram or something in 3 dimensions right next to you. So if the world was just a dream or something, then you'd imagine you can make things pop in and pop out just by really focusing and concentrating on it. But that's just not how it is. When there's something that you don't want to perceive, you can't just make it go away. When there's something that you do want to perceive, you can't just conjure it up out of nothing. So that makes it seem pretty clear, right, and distinct, that this external world is outside and it really has its own existence. It's not created by your thoughts. The third one is interesting, okay? The third one says this. It's also pretty clear that the external world really exists because when you have memories, notice that the memories are not as vivid and sharp as the current present experience is. So right now you're watching this lecture, but you're not watching it well, some of you are watching it at a later recorded time, but relative to when you're watching it now, okay? So this current experience of you attending and viewing this lecture, don't you find it to be a little bit sharper and clearer than a memory that I ask you to now dredge up? So go back in your memories and remember the first lecture that we had on Anselm and the ontological argument. And I want you to compare the 2 things, that memory with this moment. Which of the 2 things is clearer and more just sharp and vivid? I believe, and it's obvious, that it is this current experience. Memories, even people with very good and powerful memories, are never exactly as sharp, clear, vivid, distinct as the moment when you have the experience. And likewise, right now, this is the present moment. But say in 20 years, you think back to your college days, and you're like, remember that weird philosophy class I had? That was pretty cool. Now it's sort of like a faded memory. I don't remember all the details, but it was interesting. That memory that you will have then is not as vivid and clear as the present experience that you're having right now. Okay, so point taken, right? Memories are a little fuzzy and they're a little more vague and unclear than the present experience is. What could possibly explain that drop off in vividness and clarity as you go in time from the moment it happened to the memory later? The only thing that can explain that loss of vividness is if the external world exists, because if the external world exists, then the experiences in the present moment are sharper because that's when you're actually with the external objects that are generating the perception. Okay, so like, you know, if you if I'm with my cat right now, right, and I'm just looking right at her, the reason that that's very sharp and vivid is because she's physically there. She's physically there and I'm perceiving her. If I'm walking around like in a week and I'm far away from my apartment and I'm just remembering my cat, it's not going to be as vivid as like holding her and looking at her as I am right now. But if the world was just a dream, then there would be no gap, because both experiences would just be figments of your mind, right? If the world was a dream and it was something that was just mental and not actually externally real, then the original experience would be just an illusion. And the memory that you would recall of it later would be the same. So there should be like either the same clarity or the same lack of clarity. The only thing that can really account for the drop-off is that when I have the memory later, I'm no longer in the presence of the object which supplied the original perception. So now I'm basically trying to reconstitute it in the mind's eye using the imprint formed in my psychology from the previous perceptual episode. So 3 good pieces of reasoning or evidence which makes it clear to him that the external world really does exist outside of your mind. And so look at that. You know, Descartes, who started the book by saying maybe nothing's real, maybe there's only just one thing and it's you that's thinking of everything. Now he says, well, if God exists and he's good and won't deceive me, then clear and distinct stuff like this would not be false. Because imagine if this wasn't true, then God really would be messing with you, right? He would be creating a very, very realistic illusion that you would be fooled by at all times. And that would be contrary to his perfect goodness. So I'm going to read the last paragraph of the Meditation 6. And then when we come back on Thursday, you know, we'll pretty much be all done with this and we'll move ahead to the physicalist side of the debate. So you'll want to read Daniel Stoljar and J.J.C. Smart's article. They're pretty short, but try to read those for the Thursday. Anyway, here's what he says at the end, and we'll end with this. He says, from the fact that God is not a deceiver, it follows that in cases like these, I am completely free from error. But since the pressure of time of things to be done does not always allow us to stop and make such a careful check, it must be admitted that we are sometimes liable to make mistakes about particular things. I just want to like add this last point with like 30 seconds here. There's actually a 4th bullet point here that adds to this as well. And it is that you can tell your life's not like a dream because dreams are not connected into one coherent narrative. They're episodic. So I could have a dream tonight of being chased around by like a vampire, and then the next night I have a dream that I'm giving a lecture somewhere, and the next night I have a dream that I'm off camping. So they don't all hang together into one storyline, but your waking experiences do. So like right now, this experience of you watching a lecture is connected to your memory of like the other day when you watched another lecture in the same series. So your waking experiences all fit into one long linear storyline. But your dreaming experiences don't, and that's why he says you've got another good reason to trust and believe that you are not dreaming right now. And I'll read just that and we'll close on it. He says, the falsity of what my senses tell me every day, I should not have any further fears about them being false. On the contrary, the exaggerated doubts of the last few days should be dismissed as laughable. This applies especially to my principal reason for doubt, being unable to distinguish being asleep from being awake. Because I now notice that there is a big difference between the two, in that dreams are never linked by memory with all the other actions of life, as waking experiences are. If, while I am awake, anyone were suddenly to appear to me and then disappear, as happens in sleep, so that I could not see where they had come from or where they had gone, it would not be unreasonable for me to judge that he was a ghost or a vision created in my mind rather than a real man. But when I distinctly see where things come from and where and when they come to me, and when I can connect my perception of it with the rest of my whole life without a break, then I am quite certain that when I encounter these things, I am not asleep but awake. And I ought not to have even the slightest doubt of their reality, if after calling upon all the senses, as well as my memory and my intellect in order to check them, I receive no conflicting reports from any of these sources. From the fact that God is not a deceiver, it follows that in these cases I'm completely free from error. So it's interesting how his argument for dualism passes through a proof of God's existence. He believes dualism is true and that it can be proven on this basis. But interestingly, if you're Descartes anyway, absent the proof that God exists, everything would remain permanently doubtful. So in his view anyway, the knowledge that God exists is key to preserving a view of the world that's not just riddled with doubts all the time, because only the guarantee of the goodness of God allows us to place trust in the things which already seem pretty obvious and clear to us. Now, not everybody agrees with those parts of his argument. There's some that do, and other people find that his case for God is mistaken or circular in logic. But I've done my best to at least lay out the argument in the best detail I could today. So aside from a little bit of summary on the beginning on Thursday, we'll move to the next few authors. So guys, thanks again. I appreciate your attendance, I really do. But for now, I guess I'll let you go. Have a good evening, and we'll be in touch in a couple days, all right? Thank you, and see you then.